Welcome to the podcast Accessibility for All, an interview with Professor Karen Lucas about transport poverty, or perhaps more precisely, about transport inequality. Because yes, it is often due to a lack of money, education or work that people cannot use transport or cannot use transport properly. But there are many more other causes. Professor Karen Lucas is a social researcher and lecturer at the University of Manchester. She is seen as the world's leading expert on transport inequality. In this podcast, she talks about how her research developed up till now. Her interviewers are Marieke Smit and Jeroen Bastiaanse. Marieke is Head of Strategy for Mobility of the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructuur and Water Management. Jeroen is Senior Researcher at PBL, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and obtained his PhD under Karen Lucas in 2020.
Karen, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. And my name is Marieke, and next to me my knowledgeable host Jeroen. And we are very anxious to have a conversation with you about your research on transport poverty. We understand that you've been researching this topic since the late 1990s already, and we would really like to know how your interest was aroused in this subject. So can you tell us a little bit on how it all started?
Certainly. So at the time when I started this research, there was a new Labour government, and they came in with a policy called the New Deal and was very much focused on the most deprived neighbourhoods in the UK, the places where they could see that there were high levels of unemployment, poor educational attainment, high incidences of ill health, quite large crime areas where there was high incidence of particularly petty thefts and crimes and drug-related crimes, as well as poor housing conditions and environments and things like this too. But it was more of a focus for the first time on the people rather than the fabric of the place. And it was also a real emphasis with the words of social exclusion that these people had been left behind by policymakers and by government. It wasn't their fault that they were in this position and that policy needed to change. And a social exclusion unit was set up. And they had a whole series of what they call policy action teams in about 17 different areas, including, as I say, employment and health and education, but also things like shopping and financial security and accessibility to all sorts of other services, which they felt like because these places had been left behind and the people had been left behind, they didn't have the opportunities to engage with all of these participative activities that are life affirming. And they did this huge report and they came up with this whole new neighbourhood renewal strategy. But what they did was forget about transport. And I had a social science background and I was always sort of thinking about inequalities, and I was working in a transport studies unit. So I was always asking them, what about transport inequalities? And they were like, what are you on about? What do you mean? And I was like, yeah, well, it's not equal. It's not. Well, should it be equally distributed? We're not sure. It should be. Wouldn't the people who pay the most get the best? And I was like, no, hang on. So because obviously the economic model of the understanding of transport distribution, very much the sort of predict and provide, if you needed it, it would come, and that was very much like car based. And they were thinking, well, that's road users and commuters, they're the people that we should be really thinking about, not the people who can't travel. And so I just kept on and on about this idea about transport inequalities and drove the Department for Transport insane, and eventually had the opportunity to do a study for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, because transport had been left out of all this thing. And it wasn't until people started wanting to go to work, needing to get to the hospital, becoming included, that they suddenly realised they couldn't because of the lack of transport or for very poor public transport facilities in a lot of these neighbourhoods. So this became a second study of the social exclusion unit. And after a couple of years, they produced a report which was making the connections, which they then looked at the way in which transport affected all of these different other social outcomes. And I was lucky enough to be seconded to the social exclusion unit at that time to help them with the putting together of that report and that information, and it went across government. So it wasn't just a transport thing. It was also linked to the Department of Health and the Department of Work and Pensions and the Department for Education. So everybody had their own targets to meet in terms of the types of transport and accessibility responsibilities that they had. So, for example, the Department for Education would be school buses, and the Department of Health might be patient transport. So trying to bring all of these things together, as well as the land use planning functions, the service planning functions, and so on.
And Karen, it's like 20 years since that report was published, the Social Exclusion Unit report. So what is the current state of policy?
That then got rolled out, and it introduced this idea of accessibility planning. And the idea was that all local authorities should do this function, and they should look at areas where people didn't have access to public transport, identify them, and then put together an action program to make sure that they did new transport delivery in those areas, targeted towards that particular group, not just the general for all. Mm-hmm. And it got a bit dissipated in the Department for Transport, but it carried on with good effect, with lots of different schemes being put in place, like new buses, new bus routes, smaller community transport things, but also cycling and walking, all sorts of measures to try and improve the transport. Much harder to control the land use effects and the service planning effects, and obviously they're a bit more long term. Before any of that could really come into play, so the short-term stuff was dealt with. Then there was the 2008 austerity crisis, and all the funding from the local transport authorities went. And then there was no longer a Labour government. And then basically the Conservative government really wasn't interested in this agenda. It wouldn't even speak about poverty, let alone transport poverty, right? So then everything really went quiet in the UK, and it was a forgotten agenda. I mean, people like you and I, Jeroen, were still researching this issue, and it hadn't gone away, and we knew it was really important. We got better and better at being able to measure poor accessibility and deprivation, that being transport poverty, the combination of those two things. And we got, better at doing qualitative research. We had more and more evidence, but no one was interested. 2 years later, they're listening again. And still we have to wait to see if they will act, right? Listening is not the same as acting.
Absolutely. I think in the Netherlands, we see also a movement in recent years on the view on mobility and transport. We are working on goal setting in this area, trying to make accessibility standards.
I do think you have to sort of think to yourself about minimum acceptability. Then you have to think about what's reasonable for somebody to travel to a job in the general population. So how long would generally the population be prepared to, let's say, drive or cycle to a job? You know what that is. Therefore, it is good to have minimum standards set at that national level with some suggestions, but I think you have to accept that there's local flexibility. I think there are definitely. I think there's obviously issues around people having the information about the transport services if people don't necessarily use them regularly, or somebody maybe has suddenly not able to drive anymore, or they want to make a modal shift for other reasons, then they won't know about how the buses operate and the timetables. And I think that whilst obviously there are a lot of apps now, on your phone and everything, not everybody has access to those. There's this informational issue about having the information in a visible place in the public domain, not just on the bus or in the train station or on the app. So there's that, the informational side. There's also very much issues around people's feeling of safety and personal security. So feelings of, if the bus doesn't come and they're left out waiting for a long time. So there's all of those things about more like the acceptability of the service. Is it of an acceptable standard and condition that people feel that they can use it? And that's much more difficult to capture. The perception sides of things. It's like, how do you feel when you're doing this? But we do know that there's obviously groups of people that feel more uncomfortable Women, everybody sort of can think of straight away. Interestingly, actually, young men also feel very insecure on public transport because they're seen as the perpetrators of, crime and antisocial behaviour, but actually they are also the recipients, the victims of it quite a lot. Young women too, obviously, but I'm trying to think about some of the unusual, the more unusual suspects. I've done some work with LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, trans people, and they also say that they have feelings quite often of threat towards them. And also some ethnic minority groups, especially more visible, perhaps like Muslim women, for example, feel uncomfortable using the buses. What people tend to do when they feel uncomfortable is to try and travel together. And then what sometimes happens then is that because they're traveling together in a group, they're more attracted to things like racism and abuse. And it's a sort of dual thing. So we have tried to have a campaign in the UK, which is about, I hate the language of it, see it, say it, sort it, which basically means you report it. You see it, you take responsibility for your fellow travellers. And if you see something wrong, and then there are transport police that will come in there. It's been quite an effective campaign in London. They've taken it very seriously there. I think maybe less so in the rest of the country. Am I missing anything, Jeroen?
Maybe just to briefly recap what you just said. Accessibility has more aspects than just travel time, including the availability, reliability, information and travel cost, which relates to the issue of affordability. But if I understood you well, qualitative insights into people's experienced accessibility are also essential.
That's right, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And the two things together complement each other. So you do need both things, not one or the other, both of them. If all you do is the qualitative stuff, then you can't really look at the spread and the depth and the intensity of something. You don't also know where to go, where to target. So it's good to have the two things in tandem. The one other thing that comes up two other things. One is the issue of time poverty. That actually whatever you did in terms of cost or information or whatever, people just can't afford to travel on to public transport because of their time constraints. And there's that whole, particularly women who do a lot of trip chaining and escort journeys, or anybody that takes those responsibilities, that it's actually the public transport system's not so amenable to that. Interestingly, biking is. And so in the Netherlands, where you have a high level of bikeability, that's actually a very good socially inclusive thing in terms of time poverty, and people will see the bike as more a sort of private form of transport. Lots of people don't feel like they've got a voice in how the transport is organised, that transport services are very top down and they don't have an opportunity to influence what is done. They don't get to set the timetables, and they don't get to decide on the routes, and that things change in their lives. Like maybe there's a new housing estate, or maybe an employer moves location, and so they feel like they would like to be more involved in the planning process.
Well, and then maybe going towards solutions a bit more. I think there's some call for free transport, free public transport in the Netherlands. And also the concept of the 15-minute city is very popular, like making sure all facilities are close so you can reach them on foot or by bike. Do you have any view on these type of solutions?
They're good questions. So I think that, yes, the idea of a 15-minute city where you can be able to get and do things in a very short space of time is a good one. But realistically, it's not very achievable in lots of places, right? And certainly not for some activities. You will have to use some sort of transportation. I mean, there is a good argument to not be building low-cost housing, social housing, in places where you can't get to key destinations. So that's the driver. Don't put the housing in the place where people can't get to the services. Be densified. In the Netherlands, I think you've done quite a good job of that already. Don't let that go. Try not to disperse and sprawl the land uses, because that's definitely the first driver of transport-related social exclusion. It's the transport might cause, it might be the solution, but it's not usually the cause. Similarly with hospitals, you're not going to be able to have a hospital within 15 minutes of walking and cycling of every person in the population. It's not feasible. Universities. So there are these larger land use, strategic land uses that you are going to have to accept that it's going to take more than walking and cycling, and that's when the public transport services come into play, and therefore you've got to also be thinking about, like we talked about before, minimum tolerance standards for how far people are going to be prepared to go. And then when you see that it is a very, very long distance from, say, a conurbation to a hospital, I mean, you have to start wondering about whether you're actually providing enough hospital services. There are those sorts of issues as well, because as hospitals have concentrated in order to improve their, their viability, and similarly universities, what's happened is there's less of them. And that is part of the problem too. So yes, the 15-minute city concept is a good one. It's certainly a good analytical one to start scrutinizing again where might be the problems. But I think as an outcome of policy, it's a difficult one. I think there will always need to be transport services. I think that standardized things like bus services run in a standard way on fixed routes may not solve many of the problems. There may be some routing issues, some timetabling issues, some affordability issues that you can address, but there will also be plenty of places where it's really not viable to run a standard type public transport service, certainly not a rail service either. So in that case, we have to start thinking about more flexible transport solutions. In the UK, we did have a very strong community transport sector that was running small minibus services. And when we were able to make those formalised rather than in the voluntary sector, they played a big role. I think even you can think about taxi services as playing a role in some places, because you might think, well, actually, a sort of subsidising a taxi for that person in a more rural area is a much more cost-effective way of making sure that they're included than trying to get them onto some sort of public transport service. And I hate to say it, but in some cases, the car is maybe the only solution as well. I mean, we all know that we would like to see people getting out their cars, not only for the environment, but also for sort of the whole feeling of the fabric of certainly urban areas, getting rid of congestion and other problems, which electric vehicles won't solve. But there may well be arguments for the fact that there are certain groups of people that cannot survive without a car. And for example, in our country, in the UK, that's very much care workers. They tend to go from place to place to place to place to place in very short periods of time, and it would be absolutely impossible for them to do those services. Now, that's possibly an employer issue, right, rather than a transport issue, that they make them do so much and they have no breaks, but they are very, very car dependent. So here we are thinking about, well, okay, maybe what we need to do for some of those groups of people is think about subsidizing the electric vehicle.
We are working on the Social Climate Fund, and I think we are very much looking into measures that will help certain groups of people, but it's rather difficult to also make sure that we help the right groups and that we can all make this transition as a society as a whole. How can we do that in a way that everybody can join and everybody can contribute in their own way?
That's an interesting one, because I do think that often inequality is raised as a protest against these sorts of measures, particularly when they involve some form of car restraint. So we have low traffic neighbourhoods. Do you have something like this? And there is always quite often people shout, "Oh, those people, they need their cars." We're often talking about like areas in the middle of London, But when you actually look at the car traffic through that low traffic neighbourhood, it's coming from way out and going through that neighbourhood. And in fact, the traffic's not helping anybody. And that neighbourhood may be very, very low car ownership, right? But when you actually go down there and do the analysis and find out how many people have actually got cars in that low traffic neighbourhood, and you actually go and speak to them, they are not having a problem with that low traffic neighbourhood. It's just that they haven't got much of a voice. So, this idea that I was saying about involving people. So what they found, the successful ones that have happened, and these have mostly happened in London, that's been the concentration of them. There are some elsewhere, but in big cities, that's to take people with you from the beginning. So you go and you plan that low traffic neighbourhood with that neighbourhood.
Karen, regarding your current work at the University of Manchester, can you tell us a bit more about what you've been working on more recently?
So we've been working on developing a blueprint for community level transport planning as the sort of same accessibility planning model that we use in GIS, going down to very small areas, going to those areas and using qualitative methods. And that's everything from physically walking around ourselves to taking photographs and stopping people and taking the bus and seeing how it is. All of those things, but also running things like focus groups or interviews, doing some filming, various things. We use some quite creative methods to get people in the room because they don't want to talk about transport sometimes. So we've been doing things like we call chop and chat, which is a cooking thing that we cook with them and then we talk about transport. With slow sew, with a stitch and sew, we did some sewing classes. It's good if what you do is you go to a community centre where people already are doing things, and you then engage with them in the place that they are about the things you want to talk to them about. They really like it, actually. But we've only been able to do that in the context of working for Transport for Greater Manchester, who are moving to the franchising model of bus delivery and are therefore replanning the whole of the bus routes across Greater Manchester in a networked way. And so they actually are ready and willing to listen, and they also have the power and the willingness to change things. It's not much point doing that sort of exercise if you don't really plan to do anything, or if you carry on doing what you were going to do anyway. And then when you've made the difference, it's really quite good to go back and say to them, look, we did this and you said that, and is it working? Does it work? And that's very much that focus on not just the system, but the social outcomes.
So is this picked up somehow at the national level as well?
Not really, as yet. But we funded these pilot projects through funding from the university to sort of test drive them and to try to use these sort of collective co-produced methods to see if we could create this blueprint, which we did, like how to do it. And use a lot of participative mapping as well, like where people can and can't get to, and also where the safe cycle routes and walking routes are, and all of those things, collectively doing that for an area. I mean, you can't do it everywhere, but it gives you some ideas around the types of problems that people have.
Final question, Karen. Do you have any future ambitions on this field of transport and social inclusion? Any big plans coming up?
I don't really have any big plans. I would really, really feel like it was worth all the work I've done over the last 25 years if I could see that this bus franchise thing goes through and we can see that the buses are actually thinking about their social role and not an economic thing. If we could stop running buses for profitability and commercial reasons and start thinking about their social inclusion, that would feel like an achievement, okay, that over that space of time. It's great to talk to you guys because actually it means that it's not just in the UK, but it's happening elsewhere. And with that in mind as well, we did a study for the European Union DG Employment recently, and that set a sort of definition and some indicators and metrics for measuring across all the member states. And that has been published and hopefully will come into being. And I'm also hoping, like yourself, that people will be thinking about social exclusion within the context of the Social Climate Fund. I think at this stage in my career, my hope is that some of my research will come to fruition. I guess that's my main driver.
That sounds great. I would really like to thank you. And I think there are quite some parallels between the UK and the Netherlands, but also in a broader sense, it was an interesting conversation. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Marijke. Thank you, Jeroen.
Thank you so much, Karen.